Okay. All right, folks, let me just check in and make sure that this is running here. Second. Can't find the. All right, think we're set. Okay. All right, American History 1 class. It's Monday, September 14th, and hopefully you've been getting all the updates from Corbin generally and from me as well. So just a reminder, please remember to check your Corbin email. As I've been saying, I still see students who are logging in for, live Zoom sessions when I've been very specific that I'm not doing live sessions because of the situation we're in. So there are a lot of your fellow students who are scurrying around helping family members and friends who have been evacuated and displaced, and they're just not able to keep with the normal schedule, at least for the moment. And so I've moved to an asynchronous model and allowed students to come and watch these recordings whenever they're able to do that. So that's the reason, and until further notice, that's the way it's going to be. There's at least the possibility we're going to be together in the Psalm Center on Wednesday, but I would not say that that is an assurity that that's ultimately going to happen. It's possible, and we'll run with it. Obviously, if we can get back to normal, that would be great. But I don't want you to assume that that's automatically going to happen. You just have to wait for the updates, as I will be awaiting them, and then hear from me regarding what we're going to be doing. I've had a number of students sending, email questions regarding, I don't know where to look for, this assignment or that assignment or these instructions or all the rest. So guys, gals, University Etiquette 101, syllabus. Go to the syllabus that is posted on the Populi course page, and you will find not only the basic course layout, but you will also find the calendar for everything at, the last couple pages of the syllabus. It's very specifically laid out. So, and you'll be able to keep up with the reading assignments in the American Yawp text, and you'll know where we're going. You'll even know when your film reviews are due and things along those lines. So it's all in the syllabus. As far as instructions for things like film reviews, those are posted in the Populi course page too, but at a slightly different location. So you have to go to Files. This is about the 4th or 5th time I've said this, but you have to go to Files. There are 2 folders. One folder is for the course outlines that you guys can use for our class sessions, including this one. So if you do not know where the outline is for the Great Awakening, it's already posted in there. There's another folder that is for assignments and instructions. And obviously, if you click on that, you'll see all the various Word documents for our assignments this semester. So those are all there. Please make sure you access them, and you should be able to use those accordingly. Okay, I think that's basically it for now. I'm gonna hopefully, when we're back together on Wednesday, if that's actually happening, I will address the upcoming exam, which is a week from Friday. So not this Friday, not the 18th, but the following Friday, which is, I believe, the 25th. So you have about, a week and a half or so before exam number 1. And I will be posting a preparatory or study guide on probably Friday this week, so the 18th. And you'll have that a week in advance, and I will urge you all to use it and use it well. So I will be going over details, but I want you to just be thinking about the fact that over the next 7 to 10 days, you're going to have to allocate some serious studying time. And typically for an exam like this, there are 3 exams this semester, and they all carry a pretty hefty weight for the overall course. So for an exam like this, it is not uncommon for students to spend 7 to 10 hours, depending. You know, every student is a little bit different in their capacity with their studying and with their, you know, their skill sets with history in particular. So just try to map some of that out and do your best as you think forward to the next week and a half. You know, when will I be able to get some really good study time in? This is not something that you're going to want to wake up on Friday the 25th at, you know, noon after a night of playing in the video game tournament over in Farrar and, you know, study for 45 minutes. That's not going to go well for you. So we'll talk more about it. I'm going to have some suggestions for you, but for now, just think about your schedules and start figuring out what will I be able to do to set aside some time. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the Great Awakening. On Friday, I finished up, when I posted that lecture, we talked about the Enlightenment and explained some of the basic philosophers of the Enlightenment, you know, Voltaire and Locke and Hobbes, and then we ended with a connection to the Americas and talked a little bit about Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and the ways in which, especially Franklin, the ways in which Franklin took Enlightenment ideals and applied them to his own life and his own understanding of what it meant to be an American. So that's where we ended. And now I want to make some connections that are not, you know, not social and political as much as they are theological. So we have to talk about the Great Awakening. And the Yop text that you guys have been using is helpful in that it just gives you the basic components of all these topics. And, you know, I like what it says about the awakening. It's just kind of an introductory element where it tells you who and what, and, you know, kind of a general portrayal of how the Enlightenment ideas may be factored into this whole, you know, this whole aspect of American culture. So it does a really fine job of telling you about, you know, who's involved, where it happened, and some of the impact. And, you know, from a Christian perspective, we can all note, and I'll say this a couple of different times today as well, we can note that this is an important element, that God was indeed involved in expanding awareness of who he is and you know, awareness of Christ's sacrifice. These are inherently good things. And, you know, we would not want to disparage the events because we know that there's value and importance with bringing God's word to the masses. But there's another element of the Great Awakening that I need to address a little bit. And it's primarily going to center on the more, you know, emotive elements, the ideas, the concepts, the you know, the basic approach to preaching brought to the forefront by guys like George Whitefield, as opposed to somebody like Jonathan Edwards. So I'm going to try to do a bit of a compare and contrast. And one of the things that we're going to note with the awakening is, especially through the lens of somebody like Whitefield, we see that there's a great deal of concentration on emotion and maybe even some elements of manipulation through the preaching process and the marketing process that Whitefield in particular uses. And we need to be able to measure this a little bit and understand some of the nuance with the First Great Awakening, because we begin to see that, you know, as we look at the concentration on emotion that has certainly continued to be a part of evangelicalism in America, even into the 21st century, we can begin to trace back some things. And we see that not only is there an emotion, you know, an emotional context to the evangelical faith oftentimes, but there's also something of an anti-intellectual context that goes along with that. And it just kind of helps us to get our bases covered and to frame things a little bit more specifically with some nuance. So let me start here by kind of tracing us through with some comparisons and some basic statements. Why has evangelicalism continued throughout its history in the United States, especially stretching back to the mid 18th century? But so around this time, the mid 1700s, moving forward, even into now, why has there been this anti-intellectual component to the faith? Where does that come from? Is there reason for that? As we will see, there certainly is some reason for that. Does the anti-intellectual component within the evangelical orientation of the Christian faith, does that also carry with it some negatives? Or have there been some negative components that have played out? So let's outline some of the major factors here. The focus, first and foremost, with the First Awakening, and we'll see this again with the Second Awakening, is with those who listen to the message and are moved by what they hear. There's this intense conversion experience, and it was, highly effective in bringing people to faith. However, as I'm kind of leading us into this here this afternoon, it also, that emotional orientation tended, that conversion emotion kind of tended to redefine Christianity more broadly in terms of emotion, while contributing to a bit of a neglect when it came to things like theology and doctrine and the cognitive, the thought element of Christian belief. And over time, as I'm going to suggest to you here today, over time, there was some damage done here. The tendency to think about Christianity largely, sometimes even solely in terms of emotion, kind of reinforced a conception of Christianity as a non-thinking, a non-cognitive experience, something that had very little to do with the mind and understanding truth and understanding what we would now probably call apologetics, right? Knowing why you believe what you believe and having the capacity to dig into conversation that is at some level intellectually based and doctrinally based and all the rest. Well, we also see, not only is there in the conversion experience this emotional element, we see the use of vernacular language, simple folk songs, things along those lines, highly effective in reaching ordinary people, even back in the time of the Great Awakening. But we'll see, especially in a few minutes here, when I dig into it some more, we'll see with guys like Whitefield in particular, that revivalists of the Whitefield ilk, that they often went much further. Whitefield himself was very famous for almost wearing his theological doctrinal ignorance on his sleeve, as though being theologically in the know and having that developed part of one's faith, as if that was somehow equivalent to being spiritually dead. In fact, a favorite theme of Whitefield's during the course of his, his various speaking tours, right? One of his favorite themes, and one of the favorite themes of populist preachers moving forward, was to poke fun during the course of their sermons at the educated clergy. That's actually remained part of too many pulpit experiences, even in the 21st century. So we have two things so far: the conversion experience being emotional, the use of the idea that one doesn't need to know much of anything about one's faith. You just need to feel it, right? You just need to experience that emotional conversion and then, be emotionally committed, and that's good. You're good to go. Well, third, there's another element here. And we see this certainly with Whitefield, less so with Edwards, addressing individual congregants, right? Addressing people apart from their family or church. And what this did was it forced a crisis of faith. But it could also lead to a radically individualistic view of the church that rejected the intellectual riches developed over the centuries by all sorts of great minds throughout church history. We could go back to, even the very beginning, like, Origen, and even the early church fathers, even the first century church with the original disciples who became apostles, even the apostle Paul, but trace it on through into the Roman times and beyond. And you've got Origen, who I just mentioned. You go into the Middle Ages and you've got Anselm and you have Aquinas. And then you move forward in time and you have guys like Martin Luther, of course, and John Calvin and Zwingli. And then you keep moving forward. And these are all very thoughtful, very careful church fathers who laid out biblically informed doctrine and belief that were very important for the Christian faith. And the populist preachers during the awakenings, both the first and the second, tended to either minimize the efforts of guys like Luther, Calvin, and the rest that I just mentioned, either minimize them or just kind of leave them out of the whole reality of being a Christian altogether. So I think you can understand how that might have a negative impact. And instead, what these populists did was they kind of not only didn't talk about the individuals, but they also didn't talk about the doctrines themselves. So like the capacity of guys like Thomas Aquinas and Anselm and Bernard of Clairvaux and Luther and Calvin and the rest, one of their great talents was to kind of distill doctrine into statements of faith, including some creeds and confessions that were actually very meaningful to Christians, and as they tried to wrap their minds around very important though difficult concepts. And populist preachers tended to kind of dismiss that stuff, like it didn't really matter anymore. It was just that high-minded, thinking stuff. So many populist evangelicals, many of those who come to the faith, have the intention perhaps of being good Christians, but what they lack is a developed mind when it comes to the faith. They ended up doing something else, even though I would say it was largely unwittingly, so they weren't probably aware that this was happening, but they began to uncritically absorb the individualism that was coming into vogue in the mid 18th century, the mid 1700s, right? That these populists, the folks who gather at these awakening meetings and listen to these populist preachers, they begin to hear all sorts of themes regarding individualism that was very in vogue in the American cultural lexicon, right? At the time, in the mid 18th century. And they basically started taking concepts of political and social life in the American colonies and speeches about the importance of individualism, and they transferred it into their understanding of the Christian faith. So this, what we might call an atomistic, or a better term, let's see, voluntaristic, right? A voluntaristic, we call this ecclesiology, which is another big word I won't dig into for the moment. But this voluntaristic association was born that did not reflect biblical teaching so much as the political philosophy that I was just mentioning, the political philosophy of the Enlightenment and the individualism that we were talking about the other day. These things become paramount. Now, of course, these trends, I would say, were not embodied by all evangelical groups. It's important to make that note. Nor did they appear full blown on the scene right from the very beginning in 1740 or whatever the case may be. But we find seeds of the new attitudes being planted in the First Awakening, and they actually come to fruition. I would argue, as many American historians would argue, especially, my specialization isn't religious history, but I dabble in intellectual history quite a bit, and this is one of the focal points. And my colleagues like Bob Matheson, who's a former professor at Corbin, and Josh Rice and others have commented on this quite a bit. They're religious historians, and this has come to the forefront as a major discussion, that what happens in the First Awakening, predates the American Revolution, just barely, but it does. And then we see that a lot of the things that are developing in the mid 18th century really come to fruition after the Revolution and the constitutional era. And by the time of the Second Awakening, we see a lot of this really playing out in more dramatic ways. So it's why we have to spend a little time trying to work through, what's going on. So let's talk a little bit about, who I think is a critical focus for us. Because when we talk about the First Great Awakening, more often than not, George Whitefield is the guy everyone focuses on, which I understand, because his popular style of preaching is more, it's probably more representative of what the emotional element of the First Awakening looked like. And it's also true that George Whitefield in particular reached, thousands and thousands more than Jonathan Edwards ever preached to. But I want to do a bit of a compare and contrast, because I want you to know that not every preacher during this era, during the First Awakening, was doing it wrong and was, succumbing to the pressures of emotionalism. And Edwards is our best example. So in fact, it's probably more accurate to say that the First Awakening actually begins under Jonathan Edwards, even though it is, kind of reoriented under guys like George Whitefield. So Edwards is a thoroughly intellectual, thoughtful, intellectually motivated, well-rounded, holistic Christian worldview thinker. This guy is pretty amazing. And he was, for the time, I have to, we all have to remember that when we're talking about things like preaching style and whatnot. Sorry, my computer's it's not where nope, that's too far down. Oops. All right. So Edwards would, if we went to a church and went to his church, his Congregationalist church in the East Coast in Northampton, Massachusetts, I suspect that many of us would have to adjust to the style, right? So hold on, the camera here is just really kind of messing me up. Let's see if we can, okay. So this is a much different kind of preaching than we would be used to in our lifetimes. Either, for me, born in the 1970s, you guys later on, obviously, late 20th, early 21st century. So I know that, it would probably have been a bit of an adjustment. But having spent some time in Europe, specifically Britain, in my youth, and where I grew up for a time, I did get to see some semblance of these preaching styles where there's like this oration for 45 minutes or an hour of, deep historical contextual relation when it comes to the Bible and the principles and all the rest. There could be elements of fire along the way where, kind of shake the congregation up, but more often than not, these are very staid deliveries, and probably not going to be confused with any entertainer, right? And that's not their purpose. Their purpose is to dig into scriptural precepts and bring them to the congregation in various ways, whether it's through a very straight recitation of a biblical text, or whether it's through making cultural connections to the congregation. And Edwards was a master at all of this. He understood that there has to be this foundational element of the mind and doctrine and sound theology that's at the heart and the core of Christian life, knowing how, how to explain what one believes, why they believe it, what is true about these precepts in their lives. He very much believed in that. But to his great credit, I love the fact that Edwards is kind of the perfect balance here. If everyone in the First Awakening had been like Jonathan Edwards, we probably wouldn't be talking about any critique here today. But he was just such a unique guy. Most people could not have functioned like Edwards did. So Edwards brings this intellectual, theologically sound foundation to not only his own understanding of Scripture, but even to his preaching, and tries to wrap it all together for his congregants as they come and listen. And it's pretty powerful stuff. So Edwards is this balance. He's the middle ground where he believes that obviously you cannot rely too heavily on either the intellectual, doctrinal, theological components at the expense of the the emotional, the inspirational, right, elements of the faith. And he tries to bring these two things together, and he does a really amazing job of that. By 1734, he was probably the leading American theologian of the colonial era, even though he was a Congregationalist minister in Massachusetts, as I said. He comes from Puritan, very Calvinist roots, but he emphasized the importance and power of the immediate religious experience. And he certainly isn't going to, neglect either side of the equation here. So he may have been, in the pulpit, I suppose we probably would have found him to be a little bit solemn with a pretty distinct and careful enunciation and cadence, and very typical of preachers of his day. But it is important, as I've indicated here, to note that his sermons were powerful. They attracted a large following, and it's because of his capacity to take very difficult and important theological concepts and kind of gift wrap them for his listeners, for his congregants, and explain those to them, while at the same time introducing this powerful emotional element. I think it's a bit of a travesty that the sermon he's most often connected to, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," preached, you see here, in July of 1741. It's a bit of a misleading thing. The idea here is that Edwards just preaches this theology of condemnation is just kind of ludicrous, to be honest with you. It's one of the sermons that kind of puts him on the map, so to speak. It gets him a lot of press, if we want to call it that, right, at this time. But Edwards certainly was very much, I would equate him with Dietrich Bonhoeffer in this way. He certainly preached the sound doctrine that must be preached. He certainly understood that we need to treat God as God, and not as some pen pal, not as some buddy or drinking buddy of sorts. We need to treat God as he is, the creator of the universe, and magisterial in that sense. But Edwards very much was prone to preach sermons regarding inspiration and the grace of God and the love of God as well. He's not just some guy up there, thundering away and beating people over the head with this notion of vengeance, of a divine God that just wants to beat people into submission. That is a very wrong vision or version of Jonathan Edwards. So I wanted to present that to you. And by the way, Edwards also serves as a university president for a time at Yale, I believe. My mind is blanking. I believe it was Yale. It was either Princeton or Yale. So I guess for the moment, that's neither here nor there. The point being that this guy is one of the most well-respected, not only preachers and theologians, he's one of the most respected intellectuals in our country at the midpoint of the 18th century. If only there had been more like him, as I said, I think we would have seen some even more sound conversions, right? So there are conversions, and Whitefield is doing God's work, and God obviously used Whitefield, but many people who came to the faith, you have to wonder how deep their faith was when they were really pushed on it. Could they really understand? Were they really eager to understand what Christians must know about why they believe what they believe, to develop a maturity in their faith that is both inspirational but also a maturity of the mind and understanding how Christians are supposed to think. That's one of the unfortunate side effects that we see with the First Awakening, which brings us to Whitefield. So I know it looks like Whitefield. The pronunciation is Whitfield. The Brits like to do that to us from time to time. Whitefield had, if we think numerically, okay, so the number of those converted as a result of hearing a preacher preach, there's no doubt Whitefield had a much larger impact than somebody like Edwards. So here we've got Whitefield, this young English evangelical who visited the colonies in the late 1730s and early 1740s. He made a sensational appearance, preaching to the open air and in the fields, in the streets, anywhere he could gather an audience. This is what Whitefield did. And he becomes, in a very real sense, it's not wrong to say, he becomes something of a cultural celebrity, not only in the colonies. This is not the United States at that time, not only in North America and the colonies, but also over in Britain, where he traveled widely. So having been an actor as a youngster, Whitefield always retained a love for a dramatic flair, which he at this point employed in his passion to build God's kingdom. And again, I want you to note that I'm not just being critical of Whitefield. I acknowledge that at some base level, some important level, he is dedicated to preaching the word. And obviously, I think God is using this man. But I do think that there, perhaps unknowingly, and perhaps with some knowledge, that Whitefield kind of compromised himself here and there with how he approached the delivery of his message and the marketing and all the rest. So one biographer titled his book about Whitefield, "The Divine Dramatist." It says that Whitefield pioneered a new preaching style. I'm not sure if I would agree that Whitefield pioneered this, but he's one of the people who certainly played a huge role. The actor preacher, as opposed to the scholar preacher like Jonathan Edwards. So you would, if you had gone to an open air meeting, if you'd gone to one of these locations where Whitefield was preaching and you saw him, you would have seen this guy up on the stage or raising his hands in the air, stamping his feet. He would even act out personally on stage, act out Bible stories. He would weep aloud while he was in the midst of some sermon, and this emotional flair. It reminds me, although Whitefield was not, completely devoid of a conscience and virtue and devoid of doctrine, like televangelists of the 21st century, these tactics certainly remind us of the televangelists in our world who have a lot of followers, and they've duped a lot of people. They've tricked a lot of people into buying into what they say. So there is that element that is reminiscent, right? So to recapture, I think, the novelty of this, we have to realize how contrary what Whitefield did, how different that was to the somber, reserved preaching fashion of the day, which I just mentioned in passing with Jonathan Edwards. So again, going back to my time in Europe, when I was living in just outside of just outside of St. Andrews in Scotland, and then for a time we spent a brief time down in Oxford as well. And I can tell you, in both locations, we went to an actually Presbyterian church in both locations, although the Presbyterian church in Oxford felt a little bit more Anglican to me, but nonetheless, very, very traditional church services. So in both places, I got a taste of the old world preaching style, especially attending the 430-year-old or 410-year-old, whatever it was, Presbyterian church in St. Andrews. So the minister typically read a 45-minute to 1 hour sermon in a, shall we say, less than charismatic tone of voice. After all, the revivalists, pioneered extemporaneous preaching aimed at evoking, these emotional responses and aimed at changing hearts, et cetera, et cetera. So I saw some of this, and it was an adjustment. I mean, over time, I really began to appreciate it more and more. It was a very thoughtful, very, very deep and profound sermons oftentimes. I mean, really just kind of off the charts, but it's not something that most evangelicals in America experience. And so I can tell you, it's a very different association. And you contrast something like that with what people were witnessing with Whitefield, and I cannot state strongly enough how absolutely dumbfounded they probably would have been, how different this guy was. So his delivery, Whitefield's delivery, was so effective. People were just drawn to him, and he was magnetic. There are some contemporary jokes that he could bring an audience to tears just by the way he pronounced the word Mesopotamia, which is probably an exaggeration and apocryphal story, but you get the point. This guy had people hanging on every word and every action, and the way that he integrated emotion into his message. My notes are getting hung up here, so I want to make sure I don't miss a point. So it's important for us to make this connection. But there's another element to Whitefield. Whitefield promoted his tours, his preaching tours in Britain and the U.S., Britain and the colonies, I should say, by pioneering what we might regard as kind of an early form of mass marketing, borrowing heavily from marketing techniques in the commercial world of his day. So many who learn of his ministry assume that the huge crowds attracted to Whitefield's evangelistic crusades were these spontaneous gatherings, but the reality is very different. Most were carefully orchestrated. So when he planned to visit a city, he would send out assistants up to 1.5 years or 2 years in advance, and they would begin to distribute flyers, and they would line up the facilities. He also issued a constant stream of advanced publicity before he was even on site, from press releases to newspaper ads to printed copies of his previous sermons. He followed a strategy of self-promotion and publicity that was largely unheard of in religious circles of his day. He would sometimes even inflate the numbers to generate greater attention in the press or stage events, again, to draw crowds and publicity to the newspapers. All told, these were some of the best publicized events in colonial American history to that point. One historian, a guy named Harry Stout, who's at Yale, Stout sums up Whitefield's novelty by calling him America's first celebrity. So that's, I stole Stout's line of thought a little bit ago when I said that. And I think it's a very adept observation. And you might say, well, in what sense? Can we really be critical of a guy who just, does things logically and sets stuff up? Well, not entirely, no. I mean, some of it is logical. But how might we call him a celebrity as opposed to a more traditional preacher, something like that? So how is he a celebrity? In the sense that his claim to influence did not rest on institutional validation, things like degrees. He didn't have anything like a background in divinity training of any kind. So there was no degree. He was not ordained. There was no church or denomination that qualified him to represent it. He was just some guy. And that's a model in his own lifetime. That's a model that was so far beyond. It was so different than what had existed. And I would just say, can God use somebody like Whitefield? Well, the answer is obviously yes, because Whitefield was used and he did a lot of pretty powerful work, and I think much of it was good. But there is also a danger here, something that undermines, right? I do think that there's something to be said for preparation. I grant you that some, there are pastors that are pastoring churches that may not have, gone to university and, majored in biblical ministry in some form, or who did not go to divinity school or the rest. Yes, okay. Can God still use these guys and gals? Yeah, I don't think there's anything that would automatically suggest otherwise. But what we have to do is we have to be careful about the pitfall. I would say that preparation typically is what you would want. So just because there are those that don't, just because those exist out, people exist out there who are aiding their churches and pastoring their churches and doing the best they can, that doesn't mean they wouldn't have benefited from further, more formalized training at a good, good school, a good divinity school in particular, right? So those things do actually matter. And most congregations benefit from those who have gone through the formal training and who can read texts historically, contextually in their original languages, right? Understand the Greek and Hebrew, for instance, and have the training, the capacity, this holistic worldview capacity to really draw things together in impressive fashion for their congregations. That's really helpful. Well, Whitefield it's entirely his, his chutzpah, right? He's just out there doing it, right? He's like, I just want to go out there and preach. That's all he cared about. And you got to admire his tenacity, and you have to admire his desire. But would Whitefield have benefited maybe from some more formal training of his own? Probably. Many would argue yes, he would have. So Whitefield's claim to credibility rested almost entirely on his personality and his popularity. The sheer ability that Whitefield possessed to be this magnet that moved a crowd. Unlike local, pastors, ministers, revivalists like Whitefield did not address regular congregations who knew them personally. So it gives them this other advantage. They're a novelty, right? Arriving on the scene that people didn't know, and he just seems so impressive up on a stage, but nobody really knows. He doesn't have personal connections to congregation members. So he and others like him, they're drawing these mass audience together made up of strangers who had no way of knowing them personally, and who therefore could only be attracted by publicity and advertising. So what are the themes that are emerging here? The focus on emotional response, the celebrity style leader, the engineered publicity, the individual people coming to hear these guys detached from their local congregations, and I think in a sense more spiritually vulnerable. And again, my purpose is not to give a complete historical account, but only to highlight a few of the patterns here that we're beginning to see, and kind of connect some things for you after you've gone through and read the Yop text. So here's what I would say. There's no question that in both the first and the second awakening that we'll talk about, God performed mighty works. He used guys like Edwards, to be sure, he used Whitefield. I have no doubt about this. Great numbers of people became aware of their sin. They discovered the joys of forgiveness. They discovered the joys of grace. one cannot read firsthand accounts of Whitefield and other revivalists without being impressed by his fervent love of God and his hunger to see people brought into the kingdom. Okay, so this is important for us to note, and the Yop text at least makes you aware that Whitefield, in particular, had a powerful impact. But we have to make some diagnoses here. Contemporary evangelical Christians tend to have such an inherently positive view of the Great Awakenings, both the first and the second, that it's often difficult to grasp why the two movements provoked such bitter contention. So in the First Awakening, hold on a second, let's go back here. The First Awakening. Some churches, like the Presbyterians, actually split between revivalist and confessional groups, while other groups broke away entirely to become independent, often Baptist, by the way. What drove the two sides was a disagreement over the role of emotion or experience in conversion. So, right, and you guys are going to be reading about old lights and new lights, and in the Yop text, it's mentioned at least in passing. So those who were more traditional in their understanding of doctrine and theology and the traditional components of the faith, they tended to oppose the populist, revivalist preachers like Whitefield, opposed that version of the awakening, which treated the Christian life as this. So these traditionalists were the ones who were treating the Christian walk, the Christian life, as a gradual growth process in faith and holiness by this constant nurturing and maturation and concentration not only on reading scripture but becoming familiar with the basic tenets of scripture and to develop a better understanding of doctrine and theology and how it applied and all the rest. So for these folks, they insisted that there was a very rational element to the faith, and that element was absolutely critical. And they felt that the populists were dismissing that out of hand. To a degree, I would say that they could get carried away with this orientation, the more traditional, elements here. I think that approach that they leaned on so heavily tended to reflect the Enlightenment view that humans are preeminently rational creatures, right? The passions were to be distrusted as forces that interfere with reason, maybe is a way to put that. So the critics of the awakening often charged that the revivalists were subverting the faith, that they were subverting the social order by arousing the emotions of the peasant rabble, maybe would be a way to put that. By contrast, you flip this around and you have the supporters, right? The populist supporters of the awakening. What were they thinking? Well, they're obviously coming at this from the almost opposite perspective. They insisted that a merely intellectual assent to theological propositions was vacant, right? According to this view, right, what was needed was a change of heart, a new birth is one of the famous phrases coming out of the awakening. This theme came from, among other things, what we call European pietism, which had rejected the Enlightenment focus on reason to embrace the emerging kind of romantic focus on feelings. So Jonathan Edwards wrote something really interesting in 1743 on this. I'm gotta make sure I can read this right. The print is a little small. He says, our people do not so much need to have their heads stored as to have their hearts touched. One of Edwards' proteges went on to describe the best preacher as one whose, quote, heart is ravished only with the glory of divine things. So Edwards is so fascinating. Edwards really has his mind and his heart in a great spot. And there weren't enough people like him, as I said earlier. And he recognizes that the passions the passionate orientation of Christianity, those inspirational, emotional elements must be there. They help to stir the soul. But he also very much wanted to maintain the connection to the doctrine. So the emphasis on emotion was perhaps inevitable, maybe we'd say that, given that most people in the colonial era were at least nominally Christian, which meant that the primary goal of the awakening, the first awakening here that we're talking about, was to counter spiritual coldness and indifference, maybe. I think these are critical elements of the awakening that really help to lay it out for us. Early on, a number succeeded in maintaining a balance between piety and rationalism, Edwards being the most obvious, the most outstanding. So Edwards may have been able to maintain this admirable blend of intellectual and theological learning combined with spiritual fervor, but there just weren't all that many. So he's a very unique guy, but the new birth evangelicalism was more consistently described in emotional terms. And that's kind of the legacy, the primary legacy of the First Awakening. You know, the rapturous joys, the boundless felicity that kind of emotes out of people. So this is a real important element for us to understand. It's kind of the foundation in many respects for so much of modern evangelicalism, which perhaps, has done this unwittingly, but we have really downplayed, especially, in Baptist circles, for instance, we've minimized the importance of the mind, thinking like a Christian. We've minimized certain elements of doctrine and theology in favor of more emotion-based elements of the faith. Sometimes that has served us reasonably well in certain ways, of course, but there's also, there's a downside to that as well. All right, guys. So that's the First Awakening. On Wednesday, regardless of whether, hopefully, I'm really hoping that we're back together in the Psalm Center on Wednesday. That would be fantastic. If so, I mean, it'll be nice to connect with you guys once again. If we're not, if we're still, dealing with the smoke and the bad air quality and all the rest, right? If that's still the reality that we face, then I will probably do another of these recorded lectures almost assuredly by Friday. The idea is that the smoke it might take a couple days to clear, even if we get some rain tomorrow. But I think there's a really good chance we'll be together on Friday regardless. But I hope to reconnect on Wednesday, and then we'll take it from there. Stay up to speed with the reading, and remember that we have some, the upcoming topic starting Wednesday is going to be the colonial wars. And so we're going to be dipping into primarily the French and Indian War is going to be our focus. So remember to look at the outline. There's a film option, The Last of the Mohicans from 1992 with Daniel Day-Lewis in the title role as Hawkeye. If you're going to use that film as one of your two choices for the semester, remember that you have to watch that and review it and submit that review this week. So just be aware. Other than that, I think you guys should be pretty much squared away, and we're going to try to keep on task here and move things along. So thanks. I hope I hope you're all safe and sound, and we'll reconnect soon. Blessings on you all.